All right, I sure appreciate everybody turning out tonight. Tonight I want to talk a little bit about exposure. These days, our images have become more and more a part of the things we do. And you want to, as it becomes more important in our communications, we want to make certain that we get the very best image we possibly can. Now, hold on. Let me see. All right. When we look at exposure, the word photography literally means writing or drawing with light. The word comes from the Greek. A photo meaning light and graph means to draw. And exposure is how we draw with light. For those of us like my buddy Ron Hargrove and Debbie, they're on here, we learned in the film days. You guys, the younger guys, don't know anything about film. So in those days, you had to understand the process a whole lot better. To fully understand exposure, you got to understand how your digital camera actually works. And it's two parts. The first part is mechanical. When light enters through the lens and strikes your sensor, and then the rest is all software. The software then takes that information the sensor receives and puts it into something that we know as a photograph. Now, these days we've got mirrorless cameras and we've got digital SLRs. As you can see on a mirrorless camera, the light goes through and strikes the sensor directly. You're looking at an electronic viewfinder. DSLR means single lens reflex. And what happens with those cameras, you have a mirror that sends the light that comes to the camera up to your viewfinder. And when you press the shutter, the mirror comes up and the light strikes the sensor. Most people these days are buying mirrorless. Most of the manufacturers are going away from digital SLRs. A mirrorless camera is lighter, so that's the great advantage in that. So let's talk about understanding exposure. What exposure comes down to is something called dynamic range. When our camera records an image, you have light areas and you have dark areas. Famous photographer named Ansel Adams developed a system called the zone system, where he broke down the lights and darks in an image in 11 different zones. As you can see here, with 0 being absolute black and 10 being absolute white. Now, these days with our digital cameras, an 8-bit digital image records 250 levels of gray. With the zone system, it allows us to get the absolute best exposure. Because if we get it too light, then we lose detail in our darker areas. If we get it too dark, we lose detail in our lighter areas. Like here, if you took an average image thinking that we have 256 levels of gray in an 8-bit digital image, with the first one being absolute black and the 10th one being absolute white, when you look across an image, we have all these different zones. It's what we know as levels of gray. This is where we get the contrast in our image, and this is what makes our images look the best, is when we can capture all of our zones. So we want to make certain that we're getting the exposure that can capture all of that. A digital camera can capture about what we call 7 stops of light. So we have to make certain that we get our exposure where it needs to be, right in the middle. And to do this, we have 3 things we work with: aperture, shutter speed, and film speed. Now, the exposure triangle is how this works. Starting with aperture. Aperture is the opening size in your camera. It's how much light comes into the lens when you press the shutter down. Shutter speed is how long that shutter's open to allow the light to strike your sensor. ISO is talking about how sensitive your camera is to light. So these 3 things work together to create our exposure. We can have underexposed or overexposed images, but what we really want is the proper exposure where all of our different zones are showing up. See here, this one is too dark, this one is too light, and this one captures all of our zones. All right, let's start with talking about aperture. Aperture is literally the opening in your lens. Your lens has blades that create an opening to allow light to travel down and strike your sensor. And f-stops is what they're rated in. And it's really backwards thinking. The lower the number, the bigger the opening. So f2.8 would typically be like your largest opening. That's where the most light comes in. F16, F22, you have a smaller opening and allowing less light in. So when we're looking into our viewfinder, the blades that create the opening they default to the biggest opening. When we depress the shutter, it closes down to where it's set to. Your camera is what's called a open circuit. When you depress the shutter, it closes that electronic circuit that makes everything happen. The rest of the time it's set and open. So when we push the button for the shutter, our lens is going to shut down to the actual opening, allowing light in. Now, aperture does more than just control how much light. It also controls depth of field. And depth of field is the area of sharp focus in our image. A smaller opening, like 2.8, has a more narrow depth of field. That's meaning the area of sharp focus is less. A larger one, like F11, F16, F22, but the larger the number, smaller the opening, is going to give you more depth of field. For example, if we're shooting like a landscape or a group of people, and if you have 3 rows of people, you want everybody to be in focus. So if we're up here like at F22, that's going to be a smaller opening, meaning less light's coming in, but we're going to have more sharpness from the front to back. Let's say that we have a situation where we want to blur the background, like we got a speaker at a conference. We want to shoot at a lower aperture, like 2.8, F4. That way you have less area that's in focus. Like here, this photograph of the speaker at the podium here. We want to throw the background out of focus. And when we do that, it draws our attention to the speaker. So aperture will not only control how light or dark our image is, it also controls our area of sharp focus. All right. The next part is shutter speed. Once we let that light travel down the lens, the shutter speed determines how long we allow the light to strike the sensor. And when it's normally measured in fractions of a second, 1 second to 1,000th of a second. We know that under most applications, anything below a 60th of a second is too slow for us to handheld. So normally we're going to be shooting from 1/60th of a second. So that light, the amount of light comes through with the aperture, and then the shutter speed determines how long we're letting that light strike our sensor. So this is what your shutter looks like. They're called a curtain shutter. It's in pieces that moves up and down. And when we depress our shutter button and the camera's activated, that curtain is going to move up to let that light strike our sensor. And just as aperture impacts depth of field, shutter speed impacts how fast we capture the image. Like on a fast shutter speed, you're going to freeze it. If you're in a situation where you're shooting your local's basketball team playing something, you want to be able to capture as much of the action as you can. So you want to shoot at a higher shutter speed. A medium shutter speed is going to capture some of the action and maybe blur the background. A slow shutter speed anything that's standing still is going to be in sharp focus, but everything behind it's going to be blurred. So that's another situation where we can do more than just the exposure with this control. Like here on a fast shutter speed, see how the waves are captured striking the rock? You want a fast shutter speed to freeze the action for something like that. All right, this is a situation here is a bear that's standing in a creek that just caught him a salmon, and he's throwing the water off of him. By using a slower shutter speed, you capture the motion of him shaking himself. And there's probably some instances where you could use that in your photography for your local union. So you want to shoot at a lower shutter speed if you want to show the action of something, and a higher shutter speed if you want to freeze the action. All right, ISO. ISO is probably the most least understood of the things we deal with. ISO refers to how much light is coming in and how sensitive your camera is to that light. Now, ISO goes back to the film days. Back in the film days, when everybody had like a manual meter inside the camera, you had to have a consistent way for all film to work together. So ISO stands for International Standards Organization, which was an organization that used to give standards for all different types of things, including film. All right. In the old days, here's your little history lesson. Film was a piece of plastic with a chemical on it called silver halide. Silver halide contained something called a halogen atom. When light was exposed to a halogen atom, it would essentially be a burst and it would burn into that plastic. So the lighter the light was, the more intense the light was that struck those, the more it burned in. So once the film goes through the processing, light areas are dark, dark areas are light because the bright areas that halogen atom burns in. So that was where the idea of a negative come from. And we had to do reverse printing then. So right, now these days, we don't have film, we have a sensor. And most digital cameras today have something called a CMOS sensor. And what it is, it assigns brightness. Your sensor does not see a picture. It sees light. And then it takes that light and breaks it down into pixels. Your sensor is rated in megapixels, 20 to 40. And the more pixels you have, the sharper your image is going to be. And each dot on there is assigned brightness for 3 different channels, a red, a green, and a blue channel. If anything that's red in your image, that channel is going to be brighter and the red's going to overpower the other colors. And there again, we go back here to the 8-bit digital image having 256 levels of gray. So when the light strikes it, your sensor sees this, reads it, and assigns a number value for those pixels. Now, when we adjust the ISO on our camera, we can allow it to capture more things in low light. The way that works is it narrows what makes up your shades of gray. Like here, at 25,000 ISO, the image looks bright, right? We move over here to 12,800, it's not quite as bright. 6,400 is not quite as bright. 3,200, 1,600, and 800. If we look, probably 3,200 to 6,400 is a better image from the standpoint of quality. It has more contrast. It has more of our values saying where this is a little bit more washed out. What happens is, as you increase the ISO on your camera, you're shrinking the range of those zones that we talked about earlier that it can capture. So at 100 ISO, you get to use all the range. At 200, you're now using half of them. 400, you're now using a fourth of them. And so on as it gets higher. Now, that's not to say that you should never use the higher ISOs. These days, cameras have gotten better at dealing with that. But just remember, as it gets higher, you're going to limit how much information your camera can record. When that happens, we get something called clipping. As you take the 256 levels of gray and shorten them up, now your image becomes a lot more contrasting. There's not gentle shifts from one zone to the next. As that gets worse and worse, and the camera can't read all those zones, then we pick up something called digital noise. That's when the camera is now filling in information that it didn't capture because your ISO is so high. But now remember, all 3 of these things work together. We can avoid the digital noise by lowering our aperture or lowering our shutter speed so we don't need the ISO set as high. I hope that makes sense. All right, so let's talk about putting it all together. On our camera, we have different settings. Most people are going to shoot in auto. And auto is okay. In auto, we're telling our camera, I'm letting you make all the decisions. And that's good to a point, but there's situations where our camera can get fooled. If you have a backlit subject, for example, the camera reads all the light behind the subject and exposes for all that light, and then your speaker could end up being too dark. All right. We have manual, on manual, you set everything yourself. In my opinion, the camera is better than me doing all that stuff. So I'll skip manual. You have shutter priority. On shutter priority, you can go in and tell the camera what you want your shutter speed to be. Let's say if you're in that situation where you want to freeze the action, you say, okay, I want my shutter speed at 1/500th of a second or 1,000th of a second. Then the camera is going to adjust the ISO and it's going to adjust the aperture to match that. Same thing with aperture priority. If you choose the aperture priority, which would be the A. Then you say, okay, I want less depth of field. So my speaker on stage is in focus and everything behind him's out of focus. So then you're going to set the aperture where you want, and the camera will do everything else. In my opinion, the best mode to shoot in is program mode. Program mode is kind of like automatic. The camera's going to do everything, but it allows you to make changes. In program mode, I can go in and change my white balance. I can go in and change my shutter speed. I can change my aperture. I can change the ISO. And if I change all these things, the camera's going to change everything else. If you've not used program mode, I highly recommend you try that, because that's where you get your greatest flexibility. So remember, aperture is how much light we let down the tunnel into the camera. Shutter speed is how long that light strikes the sensor. And ISO is the sensitivity of that sensor to use those 256 levels of gray. Now, when we put them all together, we can get the image we want. And while the digital cameras these days have great metering systems on them, and they do a great job, there's still situations where we want to be the driver. It's like the self-driving cars. There's some situations where my son-in-law has a self-driving car, and out on the interstate, sometimes he'll engage that. But when he gets like in town and a lot of things going on, he takes it off. Your camera's the same way. Some situations, the camera can do everything for you, but you have to know how to make those adjustments. All right, questions. I know I went through this rather quickly. I'm trying not to keep you guys all night. Who has questions?
John, Ryan Martin here. So for all intents and purposes, program mode is preferable in most circumstances?
Yes, because program mode, in automatic mode, you're locked out from changing anything. The camera's going to do everything. In program mode, the camera will do everything, but it allows you to make certain changes. And I didn't get into this until like exposure compensation. Most cameras these days have something called exposure compensation, where you can compensate for what the camera's doing. And it normally does like a third of a step at a time. Like with in automatic mode, white balance. And we didn't, we're just talking about exposure tonight. White balance makes a huge difference in how your images look out. And sometimes your cameras can be fooled by the light it's reading and set the white balance to the wrong thing. In program mode, I can go in and change the white balance. I can go in and change my exposure compensation. I can change my aperture. I can change the ISO up and down. And automatic, you can't make any of those adjustments. The camera's going to do those. So program mode basically gives you the self-driving car, but allows you the ability to take it out, and you take control when you need to.
Makes sense. I would like to see a second part of this training or this instruction addressing issues about outdoor photography in the future, if you're so kind to do that.
I sure will. I'll be doing that from June 22nd to the 27th at the Luca conference. Tonight we have essentially 30 minutes of instruction. I'll be doing 12 hours of photography instruction there. So when you sign up, digital imaging is the photography class. And I know that's a shameless self-promotion, but yeah, Ryan, we could do other things. I just don't want the whole online series just to be about photography, but and I think we've done pretty good this year about doing a lot of different things. But
we certainly have covered a lot of content.
We get used to letting our cameras, and then this comes into play. Your cell phone, and while your cell phone don't have all these adjustments that we have on a digital SLR, there's a lot of things that you can do with a cell phone that impacts a lot of these things. So a elective class we're going to be having at the Luca conference will be cell phone photography. So if anybody wants to do, if you're doing something else for elective, you might want to do cell phone photography. But these days images play such a huge role into our communication. We've become a society of people who don't like to read. We want instant gratification. I personally think that's also led to a lot of the misinformation we have, because we don't want to learn the nuts and bolts of an issue. But your images say so much about the information that you put out, because even online, if you do a teaser with a photograph, the photograph can often give the readers, kind of a snippet of what to look at. When somebody comes to one of our websites, our social media, there's a lot of choices there. And we've got literally seconds to grab their attention. And a photograph can help grab that attention and point those people in the direction of the information you want to share. So being able to control the process makes a huge difference, as we're doing our images. Ryan asked about outside. Outside is one of the places where your camera can get fooled the most because we have this vast sun that's throwing beams of radiation from 90 million miles away in space at us. As
Right.
that radiation hits everything, our camera can be fooled into thinking there's more light on the subject than what it is. Remember, our digital camera can cover 7 stops from the darkest to the lightest. So in a situation like the photograph I have on the screen here, that's a mountainside. You see that, I don't know if you notice there, the moon is back here in the back.
Yep.
Trying to capture all that is quite a chore. A lot of times I see people try to do group shots of people outside in the bright sun and everybody squinting. You end up with a very contrasty image because the light is so bright. The way light works is it works at the angle of incidence, which is the point the light hits something and reflects. On a cloudy day, the lighting is a lot softer because the clouds actually become the light source. Instead of now, when light leaves the sun, it starts out like a little squiggly, like a corkscrew. And as it travels through space, that beam of radiation stretches out to a pinpoint. So by the time it reaches Earth, the light is pretty harsh. On a cloudy day, the light strikes the cloud, and now the cloud becomes the light source and not the sun, because wherever it hits first is where it becomes the light source. If you've ever had photographs done in like a photographic studio, they'll have the big soft box. And the reason they have those, a large light source produces softer light than a small light source. So if you're doing group pictures of people outside, if you can move them in the shade, you're going to get a whole lot better image every time.
Right.
So because when you move them in the shade, those zones from the lightest to the darkest now narrow because the light's not as bright. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Anybody else any questions?
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
When you have people of different color, what's the best way to arrange them so that one person's not really dark and one person's really washed out?
Well, it's not so much the arrangement, Vonda, it's getting the right exposure. Because remember, your digital camera is only able to record 7 stops from the lightest to the darkest. What happens if you put them in a situation where it's really bright outside? It's going to make it more difficult. If you have a group of people, and that's a common issue, what you want to do is try to soften the light, maybe get them in the shade. In the shade, your brightest part of the image is not quite so bright, so it narrows up the number of zones you make. You want to, in that situation, you want to avoid very harsh lighting. If you're shooting with a flash, tilt your flash up and bounce it off the ceiling. That softens the light, and it lowers the values that you're using, so you don't have the really dark and the really bright. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Anybody else?
Hey, John Hargrove, Louisville, Kentucky.
Hey, this guy's forgot more about photography than I ever knew.
I tell you, man, every time that I show up in your classes, you bring to the attention of learning something different. The last time I was with you, I never had tried program, even though that P was there on the camera. And I find myself using it more and more now versus, outside and versus inside, and versus when you got to shoot pictures of action shots of movements and to control program. How do I compensate for that if I got something that I don't want to lose and I want to get that moment?
Were you talking about freezing the action?
Well, not just freezing the action. I mean, like when as a photographer moves around, light changes, especially in the inside or out. If you got light coming through a window, you got the fluorescent lights or halogen lights, it changes the color, I guess, the temperature of the look.
Yeah.
And in program, how would I compensate for that?
Well, in program, you can still set the white balance to automatic.
Okay.
If you're in a situation where you're moving back and forth between sunlight, halogen lighting, fluorescent lighting, you might be safer to leave it, because in program, you can go to any of those controls and change something, and the camera will take your change and make all the necessary arrangements and everything else. It is a problem if I'm shooting outside. I like to set my white balance manual. And if I'm outside, I like to set the sunlight. But then if there's a difference between sunlight and cloudy, there's a difference between sunlight and shade outside. Well, oftentimes you will forget to change as you move. Now, one thing you can do to help as a backup to that is if you shoot in RAW. Remember, a lot of what happens in your camera is software related. White balance is software. Exposure compensation is software. ISO is software. All right. A raw image is exactly what the sensor captured without any changes to it. So if I'm shooting in RAW and I open that image in Photoshop, the RAW window is going to come up there and it's going to give me the option to change my white balance if I need to. It's going to give me the option to change my exposure compensation if I need to, until the processor in your camera writes that file to the disk, everything is available to change. I've recently pulled up a bunch of images I shot in Maine in 2004. And back then, the options on a digital camera were much less than they are now. I've got images that I couldn't really use from 2004 that I can use now because they're raw images. So everything my sensor captured is right there without the software being written to it. And now that I have greater control, I've been able to open up some of those images that wasn't quite so good before and make the changes now. It's just like a time machine. So if I'm in a situation where my lighting might be changing a lot, I'm going to shoot in RAW always to give me the option to go back and adjust that to what best fits each individual image. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, definitely. But I'm still playing around with it. And, it's trial and error, especially when you're in different situations, lighting situations and stuff like that. When you got the time, like a setting just like you're showing right now with the mountain side, you can create your own setting and you got time to play around. But I guess when you're dealing with people and action and stuff like that, you got to compensate and know exactly what you want at that particular time.
Oh, yeah. Journalistic photography is all about being in the moment, And in the moment, you don't have time to think white balance, exposure compensation, and all this other stuff. You have to grab the image when you can, So shooting in RAW allows you to be a little bit sloppier photographer because, like I said, so much of that image is determined not by the mechanical part of the camera, but by the software. And until that's the cool thing about the RAW file, the software has not been written to the file. As a matter of fact, you cannot overwrite a RAW file. When you open a RAW file in Photoshop and you make adjustments, it doesn't change the RAW file. It saves a copy of what you just did. But that, it's just like those main photographs from 2004, that I shot in RAW. Exactly what my camera captured is still in that file without all these changes. And as Photoshop only gets better down the road and gives you more options, there's more things I'll be able to change in them.
Gotcha.
Make sense?
Yes, sir.
Anybody
Thank you,
else?
John.
Yeah, John, how you doing tonight?
Hey, Ben. I didn't recognize you with
Question.
heavy.
I know. I've been getting that a lot lately, actually. So my question is about saturation, actually. I guess what I'm trying to figure out how to more accurately modify the saturation to convert it to from what my camera is seeing to what I'm seeing, because there's a bit of a color issue. I actually have a new phone camera and I normally shoot with my phone. Is there anything I could do in the camera settings itself to control the color saturation?
Well, that goes back to exposure, really. If we overexpose an image, it's going to wash out your color some. If we underexpose an image, it's going to dull your colors up some. So getting the right exposure is going to make certain that the camera captured these. I know this value stuff's a lot to take in, but it's really based on that. If we can get the exposure that's right in the middle, what photographers call it neutral density, meaning it's not too bright, it's not too dark. It's just like Goldilocks porridge. It's just right, By getting the right exposure to begin with, then you're not going to get your washed out colors. Another thing to remember, when we look at an image on our cell phone, we're not looking at the actual data. We're looking at the screen on our phone. Same thing with your digital camera. We can adjust the viewfinder on our phone or our digital camera to be brighter, to help us see better. Which means when we're looking at that image, you're not getting an accurate portrayal of what the data shows. Digital cameras have something called a histogram, which shows you a graphic representation of what the camera captured. Now, I think some phone software will give you a histogram view. And in most instances, we're going to have an absolute white and an absolute black in our image. If our histogram, what the histogram shows you, and this is all in my class, what the histogram shows you is that graphic from 0 to 256 and how much of your image is taken up, because that goes up and down and shows by those certain values. If you've got an image where you've got an absolute white and that histogram doesn't come all the way over to the white side, then your exposure is not correct. If you've got an image that has an absolute black and the histogram doesn't go all the way over to the dark side, then your exposure is not correct. But the color saturation is directly tied to exposure, and these 11 values that Ansel Adams came up with, because if you get the exposure exactly where it's supposed to be, what we call neutral density, not too light, not too dark, then all the colors are going to be represented the way they should be. If you're overexposed, your colors are going to be slightly washed out. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Anybody else?
Hey, John, it's Greg.
Hey, Greg, how you doing, buddy?
Good to see you, bud.
Man, good to
I
see
got a
you.
question. I got a question for you. When I set up my camera and I set the values, the color values, it's got vivid, it's got the different values for the color. What is the best color to shoot with?
What kind of camera are you using, Greg?
I've been using Olympus mainly.
Okay. In vivid kind of drives the colors a little bit, make them pop a little bit more. It goes back to your saturation. And remember, everything is connected. Exposure is kind of like trying to balance a ball bearing on a sheet of glass. If you move one way, it goes another way, then you got to move again. So vivid will give you popping colors, but to get that, it messes with your exposure and can make your image maybe more contrasty than you want it to be. Does that make sense?
Okay, so you're saying shoot more in normal than vivid. I think normal's
I would think for most instances, normal would work better. Now, let's say that you're in a situation where you're shooting a meadow that's got like, some flowers or something that you really want to pop, vivid, like I said, it's going to make all the colors exaggerated. That's essentially what vivid means, is to exaggerate the colors.
Okay. All right. I wish I'd have took this course a while back.
Yeah. I think in most situations, program mode you're going to get the best results because you have a greater control over what the camera's doing.
Okay, with that being said, John, again, thank you for taking time out. Great presentation as always. And again, if you want to go ahead and do your shameless plug again, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, if you would like to learn more, on June 22nd to the 27th, we're going to be having what I feel is maybe the greatest Luca conference we've ever had. We started working collectively, Roy, 2 weeks after the last conference. We sat down with those evaluations the council and Roy did, and we looked at what you asked for. People asked for more classes to take. We've got more classes. People wanted to be able to take more than one class. This time you've got the option to take more than one class. People ask for more time in the classroom. We've still got plenaries, but we don't have as many. We've tried to shave them down to what essential. So you got more time in the classroom. It's going to be the summertime. We're bringing back the famous Luca luau. There's so many cool things. This is one Luca conference you don't want to miss because we have started planning so early and put so much attention to detail we think this is going to be the best one we've ever had.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we look forward to seeing everybody. Just another note, we have the podcasting webinar is coming up next. And sorry for anybody who had issues signing in. There's obviously a problem with the link, and we'll try to work that out. Other than that, thank you, John. Thank you for everybody for attending. And we'll see you next month. And we'll definitely see you at the conference. Thank you. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, everybody. I sure appreciate it.
All right.